Alrighty, welcome. We're going to talk about Mythic Plus fixes because I've been playing a lot of Mythic Plus, and I like raiding, but Mythic Plus has actually kind of become my primary game mode, just based on amount of time spent, because it's something you can do all the time instead of just raiding, where you kind of get to do it once a week. So I wanted to talk about the affixes, my thoughts on them. I will talk about some of them like warrior specific, but I will mainly want to talk about them in like a general sense, right? And first, we have. Honestly, I'm going to start with Fortified and Tyrannical. I think that's a good place to start because every key starts with one of these two. Fortified, I honestly don't really have a problem with. Um, I was debating making another tier slot here, which is just Fortified and Tyrannical. But I think how the game works right now, or how the dungeon designs are right now, one is obviously better than the other. So I'm going to put Fortified at good. There's not many things that you're really going to be dealing with that are too difficult with Fortified. Fortified by itself is fine, but Fortified when it's paired with other things such as Raging or Bolstering end up making things way, way worse for everybody. I don't think the affix itself is a problem. But I think it's how the combination of affixes work that make something like Fortified a problem. Whereas Tyrannical itself is a pretty significant problem in the game currently. But Fortified, I think, is pretty good. It's just general throughput through the dungeons. The bosses don't last as long. You're just chunking your way through a bunch of mobs, holding W key. There are, depending on like, if you think like Waycrest Manor kind of things, that there's mobs to kick. Fortified is excessively dangerous when mobs have like a volley type cast where they're hitting other people and not just the tank, which makes them immensely dangerous. But those are dealable things, right? You can stun, you can kick, you can knock them up, you can do whatever. So I think Bolster or Fortified itself is pretty good. The next we're going to talk about is Bursting. And I'm putting Bursting also in the good for affixes. I will put it ahead of Fortified. But to be fair as well, I'm a bit biased towards bursting, mainly because bursting is something that you have complete control over as a group. And bursting is something that warriors don't really deal with much because we have second wind. If you play second wind on a bursting week, I'm pretty sure bursting is considered environmental damage, and it doesn't actually break the passive effect of second wind. So even if you have like 6, 7 stacks that are just rolling and you're going through the mobs, you're healing 6% health every second, and that's just enough to keep you up, you know? Like, warriors don't really engage with bursting that much, and when we can keep up things like second wind, if they don't get knocked down by like a cleave or a spare cast, we're big chillin'. But one of the reasons why I think bursting is a good affix, even though it's an on death affixes generally are pretty problematic. I think that because it is very controllable in what it does, and you can either make it easier or harder on yourself and your group by killing more or less or rolling it, etc. I think it's a good affix. It changes the way you play the dungeons slightly without being so obnoxious or such a problem that you end up playing them in a completely different manner, right? And now moving on to, I believe this thing here is this is bolstering, and obviously it's going down here. Bolstering is terrible. The biggest problem with it, obviously, is it does too much. There are too many mobs that scale. One of the best things and most fun about doing Mythic Plus and Mythic Plus dungeons is just doing big pulls, killing big mobs, and just getting big chunky damage in. People like that. That's fun. That's enjoyable. And bolstering is so negatively impactful. I think that it is a key level difference of negative value with how problematic bolstering is. It can depend on the dungeon. Whether or not bolstering is that big of a deal. But if a Mythic Plus affix is so impactful that you will probably just by design do -1 key levels at minimum because of it, I think it's a massive problem. You look at something like Everbloom as well, when I talked about bursting, where all of the on death affixes applying to everything around them. The little flowers bursting, and the flowers I think have like a fourth of the HP of the mobs that are actually casting and dealing damage. You're buffing abominations, berserkers, etc., etc. Um, bolstering's even rough on like, even though Rise has very few trash mobs, just pulling any mobs with like the maiden, for example, outside of what the maiden pulls with, where she's just doing big AoE damage, even though it's not fortified, she's just completely decimating your group just because bolstering exists. It is a significant problem. I think my favorite thing about affixes is they do slightly change what you're doing, but they don't negatively impact you to the point of either lesser key level or significantly changing like a dungeon route. And I think Bolstered is just not great. They've tried to do different iterations of it. Maybe they could do something where the mob size, and maybe they could do something where it's more fun, where the mob size increases, so that means their hitbox and their melee range increases and stuff like that for fun, but it's capped out at 10% bonus damage. You know, when every single mob in a pack is buffing by like 20%, then it just becomes a point where even your tank is just getting one shot by random casts, right? So I think that bolstering could be fun, it could be fine. It could even be a pretty decent affix, but if it capped out the amount of damage it was allowed to give, like let's say bolstering only um bolstering only gave 1% per mob, and then it capped out at max 10%, it still might be a little more difficult, but then it wouldn't be so difficult that it would be unplayable as an affix. And when you compare it to other on-death affixes, I don't think that would be too big of a detriment or too out of balance compared to the other ones. The next we have is Raging, and Raging is also going in the bolstered tier. Uh, the biggest issue with Raging is the only class in the entire game that can actually take care of Raging on a consistent basis is Evoker. With a pressing roar, it de-enrages every target hit, and there are classes that do have de-enrages, hunters, rogues. I don't think Mind Soothe does. I don't know all of the classes exactly that do have a de-enrage, but the fact that you're not going to be able to deal with an entire pack of things that are de-enraging and they become CC immune, I think is a pretty significant problem. Any caster, this becomes a significant problem. Like, one of the worst cases I've seen is the mobs before Oakheart in DHT, the channeling fear guys. The moment they start getting enraged, and then if their health values are different, you can stun some, you can't stun the other ones. The moment one or two people in your group start getting fear chained, it's just over. And the problem is Raging, because it just makes it so you can't CC. If Raging ate a CC, like people suggested before, where it had like, if it ate one CC and then the next CC could overlap it, something like that could work. Because I could imagine, like, as a warrior, right, we could shockwave, or we could intimidating shout, and then that would break the raging bonus, and then they could sigil of silence or something like that would be good. But I think it's negatively impactful enough when you're not allowed to control the mobs, and then when mobs are designed where if you don't control them, it's a problem. And now there's only one class in the entire game that can consistently, in an AoE scenario, control those mobs and make sure they're controllable. I think bolstering is a significant problem. Evokers having an AoE soothe is cool, but them being the only class in the game that is allowed to use it, I think, is an issue. And it makes bolstering it makes enraging far worse than what it could be or should be. And it probably needs to be looked at. I don't remember. I think this is Incorporeal and this is Afflicted. Incorporeal is going into bad. It's not the worst thing in the world, but there are multiple classes, obviously Warrior included, that can't interact or deal with it. I think affixes like this, where let's say your DPS utility classes are able to deal with it most of the time, and all of these different things are just considered a healer affix, right? Oh, the healer has to dispel the afflicted. The healer has to CC the incorporeal. Oh, we need a druid so they can hibernate one and cyclone the other, and they'll just take care of it themselves. I think the incorporeals just kind of suck. They were an interesting potential as an addition, but they limit class viability. They are can be annoying to deal with. Targeting them correctly through mobs is also kind of annoying. And they're not the best, they're not the worst, but they are certainly uh, not what I would want to see in an affix, right? When I think about Mythic plus affixes, what I would like to see personally is something that all classes can interact with. I think it's fine if there's other classes that can do things better than other people. But when you have things like Incorporeal, where there is no way to consistently deal with them, for example, they made Warriors Shattering Throw. A 3-minute cooldown lets you deal with one of the affix. It is also a cast, and it's a talent point. To deal with one affix every 3 minutes. It's just not worth taking. It's not interesting. It's not fun. It's not interactive. I do like that you're able to kick the incorporeals. I think the fact that when you CC them and they're immune and you can't break those CCs accidentally is good. There's actually a lot of things that are decent about the affix itself, but I don't think it's necessarily good as is, and I would like to see I don't know, maybe some potential of, let's say you're fighting a pack where you don't need that many kicks, or maybe your tank can take care of a lot of the kicks because he's running like he's a Vengeance Demon Hunter. Maybe just kicking the mob twice kills it instantly, right? Something that, yeah, it might affect your current pull, but it's not going to be something you have no way to deal with, nor is it just going to turn into heal or do a fix kind of thing, right? So I think Incorporeal certainly needs a little work, but it's honestly not that bad. Now we go into Tyrannical. Tyrannical, I'm going to put as not as bad as Bolstering and Raging. I'll put it at the worst of the bad, because I think that boss fights that take forever just kind of suck. And then when I think about boss fights, like if I think about season 4, right, and it's possible that we're getting something like Algathar Academy back. I like Algathar Academy, but when you fight a boss like Croth, where you only have a limited number of stack removal from the boss, from his Screech, right? At a certain point, the boss living that long will just kill you, and that's not really fun. Especially when you have to try and figure out how to balance single target versus AoE, especially in a dungeon scenario, which that part's a little more interesting, but I think that Tyrannical itself, because of the boss fight length, is a big problem, and because a lot of the bosses are dungeon bosses, they're not designed to be mechanically intricate. These bosses are designed to just do some damage, and then they're just live longer than a normal mob in a lot of these dungeons. They become incredibly problematic when their simple mechanics just turn into one-shots constantly, where it's like, oh, did you... Like, we need stuff like this website here, which is not even close, where it's like, oh, are you doing a Tal Dazar? What about Soul Rend? Okay, well, it's plus or minus 2%. Okay. Like Soul Rend, oh, can you... Let's say we do 29 Fortified. Can you live with this defensive? Okay, you can live with both of these defensives active. All right, cool, right? These tools, I think, are really cool. I think that having a resource like this is awesome, and being able to pick and plan and really actually like put a lot of effort into what you're doing and how you're going to do it is really good. But when a dungeon boss is such a problem that you require this kind of resource, I think it becomes an issue on that front where I would rather the DOSes do less damage. But if you personally do not do enough damage to kill them within the dungeon timer, then that's when you fail the key, right? But moving on from Tyrannical, there's a lot that's been said. There's a lot that still can be said. But I think the issue, once again, is just bosses take too long. And because they're designed around simple mechanics, those simple mechanics start hitting way too hard. And you have to start playing the game more for living than you do doing damage, which is the fun part. To Entangled, I think Entangled's good. Um, the visual effect for it can be kind of weird sometimes. Sometimes you don't even notice it's going off. But weak auras and other things like that alleviate that. Entangling is kind of low impact, but it still can actually change how your dungeon pulls go based on when it spawns. Like, does your tank need to move? Can you tank them here? Do you need to move here? Like, if you think something like about a Tall Dazar, where it's like, okay, you're all grouped underneath the Juggernauts, for example, and you're baiting them out with statue. You're like, okay, entangling pops. You can have different things like Fade, Tiger's Lust, Freedoms, other root removals that can deal with that. So utility can work there, but having something make a difference in your key, but also be very simple to deal with, and its negative side effect can kill you. It's not like Thundering where it stuns you and then deals 130% of your health. It's just, hey, you get stunned for a bit. It's not the biggest deal, but if you get stunned at the wrong time in the wrong place because you're not moving correctly or not paying attention, then you die from that. That's your fault. I think that's a good affix where it's simple to deal with. It is not too difficult in terms of what you have to do, but it changes up your key enough to where it's different that week without being a big enough detriment to the key level. Spiteful. Spiteful initially for me, especially playing before they made the change, was more towards bad, right? Spiteful was more towards bad for me. But I like Spiteful. Not only because as a Fury Warrior, I can just sit there and eat the Spitefuls most of the time, and it's not that big of a deal. But now, the damage Spitefuls do are capped at plus 20. And even doing bigger pools, they're not going to instantly kill you if they're hitting you, right? And I think that capping things at plus 20, which is where the reward structure realistically stops, is something Blizzard needs to look into more when it comes to some of or how some abilities work, and just let the scaling take place instead. But I think what they did where Spiteful is capped at 20 is very good. It changes how your keys go. It isn't mega impactful, but if you're not paying attention, it can catch you and it can kill you, just like the other two affixes if you're not doing things right. So I personally like Spiteful, but once again, I'm biased because I don't really interact with it much. I can just kind of tank it as a Fury Warrior. Afflicted. Initially, my thoughts on Afflicted were that, yeah, it's kind of like Incorporeal and it's bad, but the reality of Afflicted is it's down here with the other two. Afflicted is a serious issue because obviously, once again, Warrior, a class with no dispel or utility or no way to interact with the affix, and other classes that can't really interact with the affix, makes it kind of impossible to deal with, and in certain situations, a group killer. When this thing spawns, let's say you're pulling let's say you're doing Darkheart Thicket, right? And you have a couple poisoners in the group, and then you have to deal with 2 or 3 poisons, 2 afflicted spawns, and you're trying to either cauterize or deal with the mobs doing leap and putting grievous wounds on people, where the cats do the jump and put the bleed on you. Afflicted becomes an immense problem, and the only class, funnily enough, in the entire game that can deal with this shit effectively is Shaman. Poison Cleansing Totem simply solos this affix. I mean, sometimes you might need to dispel healer there, but if you have poison cleansing totem in those situations I'm talking about, where you have to dispel multiple things on top of the afflicted, you're doing fine. But like raging, only one class being able to essentially deal with the mechanic in an effective way makes it a major problem. And then depending on the key level, like you can even look at Everbloom with the dispels there. There are certain dispels you can do from the Soul Blade dot and other things in like Blackrock Hold. There are certain dots that are put on by different mobs in the other dungeons as well. I can't think of them off the top of my head, but basically, Afflicted is a problem because those dungeons and those polls were designed around having maybe one or two dispels and dealing with it that way. But the moment you add an extra one or two dispels, when you obviously don't pull extra things because you don't have those dispels, it makes it a complete problem on many levels. And I think Afflicted is a failure of an affix. I think it impacts the group way too much, and it's also non-interactive for a significant amount of players. It's also problematic because Afflicted is considered a friendly target, where it can be difficult to do mouse over macros to them. It can be difficult to target them correctly. They can spawn inside of bosses and inside of other things, which make them more difficult to see, more difficult to deal with. I think Afflicted's either need some kind of rework, or I'm honestly not sure. Maybe they need to spawn as a neutral mob, and then things like Enraged Dispels should also be able to deal with Inflicted. But even then, that's just a issue of the affix itself, um, because it just requires so much extra of you compared to everything else, and I don't think it's a very good affix compared to everything else. Next, we have Storming. Honestly, I'm going to treat Storming and Volcanic the same way. Um, because they're kind of the same thing. I feel like Volcanic is built to deal with range players and Storming is built to deal with melee. Personally, I hate Storming. Storming is really annoying to deal with as melee, especially as one of the very few melee in the entire game that has to deal with 5-yard range on top of Storming, meaning if you get hit by Storming, you can't hit the mobs, you can't do anything. I think Storming's interaction to where it can knock you out of something, like if you think of the last boss in Dawn of the Infinite, Murazon's Rise, where you have to stand in those small circles to slow down the orbs dropping so they don't blow up at the same time. Both Volcanic and Storming can knock you out of those, but they are wide enough to where if you're paying attention, you should be able to dodge them, right? So I don't think they're bad just because of that. I am personally biased as a melee against Storming because I think it's so annoying. But realistically, I think they're both good affixes where, yeah, they're annoying. Yeah, they kind of interact with your group, but they're not killing your key. They're not. There are certain scenarios where, like, if your tank gets hit by a Storming and then the mobs start to evade, there can be problems. But realistically, these things are not. I can't put Volcanic up here and then put Storming down here. I mean, I guess I can. This is my list. I am biased. I don't think Storming is nearly as bad as something like Tyrannical, obviously, but I do think Storming is far more impactful than Volcanic. Um, but one thing maybe I would like to see with Storming is I feel like I want them to be more interesting. So for example, I think if a Storming times out, like if nobody hits the Storming and the Storming times out, it should leave a little ball that you can get haste from, and then maybe you can stack a couple stacks of extra haste from that, and it's just a reward for not being hit by the mechanic and doing it correctly. It doesn't need to be a lot, but something to make it a little more interactive and interesting. Um, I don't know if Volcanic is impactful enough that you should maybe give it a bonus if you don't get hit by it because it's fairly easy to deal with. But there is something to be said about Volcanic spawning under previously existing ground effects and screwing you over. So I don't know. I feel like either these have to be together in the good or down in the bad. Um, they do not. It's weird because you can deal with them. Honestly, they're just annoying. I don't think they're a problem, but I just think they're annoying, realistically. So I probably do this. And this is just my personal bias against storming and bias against only having 5 yard range as warrior. If I had like 8 yard range as warrior with a talent point, I would be able to actually still hit the mobs if I get knocked up by this, and it wouldn't be that big of a deal. But I think storming's annoying enough. And the fact that uh, no, I don't know where I was going with that. I just don't like storming that much, so I'm gonna keep it here. I think volcanic is way easier to deal with, although that could just be because I'm melee brain, right? And now we move on to sanguine, sanguini. Um, sanguine, I think, is they made a change to where the mobs could only be affected by one pool of sanguine at a time. Um, and I think that sanguine probably could use one more small change. I don't think it's bolstered tier of bad, but I think it's not great. One thing I would like to see personally with Sanguine is instead of the mobs dying and then Sanguine instantly spawning, maybe they could change it to where after like 2 seconds after a mob dies, like the mob spawns like a blood droplet or something, and then that droplet hits the floor and goes into the sanguine pool. That way, even if you're killing mobs and you're pulling them away from those droplets, that you can, and it's still the same affix, it still covers the same area, but it allows you to kill something, move, kill something, move, kill something, move, and deal with the affix without it affecting your group or the mob's health pool, without it being an instant on drop effect. It also help melee as well, because the moment something dies and inflict it and the pool spawns, and then maybe you have to walk through it, maybe you don't. Maybe you walk around it, but then that takes time away. I just think that delaying its spawn time to that area would really make the affix more enjoyable to play with. It's still obviously not that great compared to everything else, but I think that change would make it more along the lines of like an entangling or a spiteful, where it feels a little more manageable to deal with, and you're able to negate its effects far more significantly. Um, Also, it doesn't help that meta classes like DH already have Mortal Dance that they can take, which reduces the amount of healing from a group. Whereas something Warrior does have um, healing reduction, and Rogues have healing reduction, but we can't spread it nearly as well as the other two classes. So I would like to see that done for Sanguine, but I think that's kind of where we're at. Realistically, bolstering needs to either just essentially be a cosmetic fix where it makes the mobs bigger, um, or I'm not really sure exactly what to do. Maybe just get rid of it. And I think raging is a problem because it's very non-interactive with everybody else. And afflicted, once again, I think afflicted's main issue is on top of the fact that you need additional dispels to deal with it, further hampering your comp density or your comp complexity, etc., etc. Is that afflicted also essentially just it hinders it hinders the ability for people to design dungeons, right? Because let's say they're going to design a dungeon and they design something like Brackenhide Hollow, and then okay, we have to do Brackenhide Hollow. You have these dispels and this problem. You can kind of deal with that with the like vials that you could use to cleanse yourself in Brackenhide. But imagine you're dealing with all of those different dispels in a place like that, plus you're dealing with afflicted at the same time. It just sucks, right? It just sucks. So I think afflicted is negative mainly because of how it impacts your group too significantly, and I think it actually limits potential dungeon design if they want to consider Mythic Plus when they design dungeons. Wow. I did not expect to talk that long about this short amount of affixes, but I did, and here we are. And now I'm gonna stop because I've talked a lot and get some water. We passed the fucking 30-minute threshold. Jesus. All right. Well, anyway, thanks for watching. I don't know why I like gabbing about this shit, but I do. Maybe I need to be a little more concise with it. Because some feedback that you guys have given me is being a little more prepared ahead of time for stuff. I don't know whether or not that's dealing with video length. Maybe they can be shorter. This video probably could have been shorter. But I've been putting effort into trying to improve that. This affix video was kind of spontaneous for me, but I will try to keep the length not nearly as impactful. Or who knows, maybe the length is fine. But anyway, thanks for watching. I'll catch you next time. Bye-bye.